Martin was one of the first people that came to mind when Will and I started working on this project. I've crossed paths with Martin a number of times in the last 15 years or so in my career. And when Will and I were having conversations about what's going on for youth, for kids these days, one of the things that came up for me was recognizing that there's things that we're missing. There's things that he and I are doing as parents, as therapists, as educators, but we know that things are getting worse, right? Will, you've written this a number of times before. There's more therapists and psychologists now than there ever has been in any point in time, and we've got maybe the most significant mental health crisis in our youth populations that we've also ever seen. So we're missing something. So maybe we need to look back. And I told Will that there was a little green book in the 1990s that was significantly impactful for those of us at the time that were doing youth work in Canada. We've learned since that it's become a bit of an international book. It has shown up in different places. It was used by the government in South Africa when Nelson Mandela came into power, and the youth work programs that were put in place there. They were getting trainings done by Martin and his colleagues that wrote Reclaiming Youth at Risk was the name of the book. But this little green book was based on Indigenous teaching. Martin and his colleagues at Augustana University for decades had been talking with Indigenous communities, working with programs that had run interventions with youth, trying to identify how best can we address, the in brackets or quotations, youth at risk. Martin comes to this as not only as an Indigenous educator, but as a psychologist and a professor of 30 years, as well as an ordained minister. So he walks many paths and was, one of the significant pieces of this project. What they produced was something called the Circle of Courage model. And many people would say, well, it's not theoretical, it's not a testable thing, it's a conceptual model, but it's based on the traditional Lakota or Plains native tribes in America, both Canada and the United States, medicine wheel. It uses the four quadrants, but what they put in those four quadrants and have been defined by Indigenous teachings and Indigenous parenting practices has been also subsequently tested in youth development circles and has empirical support, which Martin, was kind of joking about the fact that science caught up with tradition. But these four quadrants are basically belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. Lots of folks in different circles and youth development have come up with different models. They've put different language to it. Belonging can be thought of as significance or connection, being in relationship with. Mastery can be thought of as skills or competence or a sense of pride in being able to do something that contributes to the family or to the community. Independence is where one's sense of personal power and autonomy grow. And then generosity completes the circle, which is the development of virtue or the giving back. So being able to contribute back to others. And I know in some Indigenous communities that I've worked with, sometimes that means you get to a point where you've developed a set of skills that adults would have that you were then doing and then contributing to the whole, whether that's hunting, gathering, weaving, cooking, it doesn't matter. But this model, when put into practice, at least in North America, in youth work contexts and in therapeutic programs, became a place where people could develop their programs based on the four quadrants. So for your particular population, in your particular cultural context or community, what does belonging mean? What does mastery mean? And that interpretation led to many programs that I've had the chance to work with over the years. Some are still using the Circle of Courage model explicitly, but some are also, you can see it implicitly in their program models. So it's there. And one of the basic primary needs that Martin was pointing out was the need for connection. If we're not in relationship, we're basically in a position where we will be led to ill health. The old proverb of "it takes a village" is kind of cliche now, it's used too often, but you do really need to raise a child within a community that's surrounded by healthy adults. In our first talk, we were talking about Gordon Neufeld, and we were talking about peer influence and peer orientation versus adult influence and adult orientation, especially in a teen years when values and belief systems are being developed and fortified. And I think that's what we learned mostly from the model. And then Martin was also willing to share with us a few ideas around Indigenous teaching methodology, if we want to use that word, and how parents and other adults in those communities and in other cultural contexts have learned through story and metaphor. And one story that he shared was in his writing that he shared with us is about the buffalo and the lessons from the buffalo. And in essence, I'm not going to read or lay any claim to having the rights to teach a Lakota story, but the lesson is ecological and evolutionary and so important that it has great deep meaning to it. And so basically, when the buffalo are under threat, they organize themselves in a protective formation, and it's a formation that's most likely to guarantee success of the herd. And so that puts the calves, the youngest, and what are considered the most valuable for the future success of the herd in the center. You can also imagine that they don't have the strength and the skills to defend themselves from the predator. The next circle around the calves is the cows, because they're the next most important for the success of the herd. And ultimately, you can imagine the bulls have to be on the outside circle to protect the cows and the calves. Should the danger, get past the bulls, then the cows are there to protect the calves. And this is a teaching story that's, again, it's based on the necessities to survive as a herd. And it's kind of the ultimate expression of the natural order of things, but it's also a good teaching story, for it shows what role modeling and care looks like in a family or in a herd in this case. So the child, or in this case, the calf, gets to see what the cows and the bulls are doing, and they can also imagine their future in the order. And it's an ecological and evolutionary story. And it's one that, is easily reflected in cultural practices and practices that adults can take on to help their children, especially in the case of when there's harm. And the concepts here of starving and gorging can be talked about in simple things in parenting practices that we're trying to build from these teaching stories in the book, such as, say, families eating dinner together at the table, right? Seems like a pretty simple intervention, but it's actually a very, very pragmatic and deeply impactful one. And some of those things become more obvious when you see research associated with the loss of that practice of families actually sitting and having family meals together. I'm going to stop there, Will.
Yep. And there's also
add.
Yeah, there's also just some research that we put into the book about the links between families that have dinner together a certain number of times a week and prevalence of substance misuse. So there is some interesting correlational research there as well. So the next person with a fascinating origin story, Mari grew up in rural Canada with no running water, and her father was a therapist, and she finished her bachelor's degree at 18 years old and shot off to Paris to model professionally. Came back, went to school, and has been one of these. This is the cover of the second edition of Minds, but one of these really, the people that are the person going on with the phones and the technology. But Mari's also critical angle of therapy and mental health was also really interesting, that often when we're diagnosing, pathologizing, and subsequently medicating kids that just aren't fitting into what could be a really uncooperative system. And she jokingly said, we we used to strap children and hit them, and now it's all sedating. But it's funny to think of someone who grew up really off the grid who is being critical about the phones, but she's not anti-technology at all, and she's really interesting to hear about her ideas of how we can integrate technology into our lives versus when we have it as an interference.
Yeah, I think on that interference versus integration, well, the maybe one of the key takeaways is that um, we all have access to and some level of integration with technology. It's really hard to get away from that now. I mean, unless you're taking on some kind of work that puts you out away from cell connection and or some other form of technological connection, then you're probably going to have it in your life. And again, Mari's not anti-technology, but she is gravely concerned about some of the effects of these technologies. And I think, Will, we're gonna do a bit of a deep dive on phones in a later session. But for now, I think one of the big important things is to talk about how whether it's gaming, social media, pornography, just the use of your own devices for your own work. Um, we're all and even television. Let's include television there because there's a good piece that she adds on that front. Things go wrong when things go beyond integration and move into interference. And I think one of the most relevant examples that she gave in terms of understanding the difference would be between a video game in which two people are playing. One of them is a 13-year-old who's now dysregulated and has an addiction. Their frontal lobes have been hijacked. They're getting extreme dopamine dumps whenever they reach a certain level or achieve some satisfactory point in the game. I don't know the language for that because I have to avoid those things myself. I have for decades. Um, Whereas, say, a game developer will play the exact same game, have a very rational frontal lobe experience, will be making changes in their programming to the game, and will have small little drips of dopamine at each conclusion of some objective that they're trying to fix in that game, same technology. One is experiencing digital integration and one is experiencing digital interference. Two very, very different things. Um, when it comes to child development and youth development, one area that Mari's quite concerned of, and her clinic with her father, they use EEG, so they're actually measuring brain waves. They're looking at, the difference between being in an alpha, gamma, theta state. And what she's described and explained to us is essentially that young people's frontal lobes are being hijacked. And what they're seeing is primarily diminishment in things like creativity and motivation. And so if you think of a young person and you take away creativity and motivation, you can see how it can become a fairly quickly positive reinforcing loop of gaming, gaming, gaming. And with that maximum dopamine dump that comes from some level of success in the game, their receptors get shut off and they actually have to achieve higher levels, play longer, play more intense, play faster to then achieve the same kind of outcome, which means, again, a positive reinforcing loop that makes the addiction worse. On the positive side, she said, full recovery, abstinence would be great, but when parents and other adults can assist a young person in limiting exposure, putting, some boundaries around it so that it's either scheduled or timed or shut off at certain times. Those are the types of things that we're talking about in the book. And the last thing I'd like to talk about, maybe before we move on, Will, is the sort of like the axis of evil. I've just named it that, but the three sort of the pinnacle of dangers with social media and devices: the infinite scroll, like buttons, and the algorithm. Those three pieces have become the most destructive parts of our integration with technology. Both the inventor of the infinite scroll, the engineer that produced that, as well as the like button, both of these individuals, I don't recall their names, but we write about them in the book. both of them have sworn off social media, no longer use those functions themselves, and express regret for the harm that's being caused. And we've cited some studies where like the the more intensive use of social media, including Facebook, I think it was primarily a Facebook study, the lower the mental well-being and health. So those three are sort of like the axis of evil when it comes to how young people and adults, because we're all, probably experiencing some of this, are gorging with technology, potentially to make up for or to fill some void that's missing in our mental well-being. Um, I think maybe the last thing, Will, is just, we hear numbers all the time about average amounts of screen time use. We know that it's really hard to get a good, clear picture of what that is. We're hearing things like teens are like 7.5 hours of screen time a day. Oftentimes, those studies are just looking at screen time for entertainment use, not school, not doing their homework, not doing research. And so for some, those numbers are really excessive. And as the adults in the room, which is one of our theses in the book, is we need to get ahead of that. We need to figure out ways to find digital integration for ourselves and potentially for those that we work with or are raising or teach or coach. I could go
Yeah.
on, Will, but I'm going to stop there because I know you got more slides to get through.
No, that's good. And Martin brought this up that even if we're at work and we get home from a busy day of work and our young children are there, nowadays we even have the phone to say, I'll just do 2 or 3 more work emails, where it used to be we'd come home and try to be present. And
Mhm.
so that's an interesting development that has also changed as well. So it is interesting when you, even though young people are, I mean, I have all my social media stuff, and many of you know I'm probably too attached to that in my own right, that one of the things is we can think that we're all really hyper connected. I know I have professional networks all over the world of people I can connect with, write with. Nevin and I talk all the time through technology, but still what we're seeing is loneliness is just creeping up and up and up. And these numbers are this was published in 2021, but the data is up till from 2012 to 2018, we're talking pre-pandemic. So this is all super fascinating data, and this is 15 to 16-year-olds and over 1 million of them, how they reported these findings. So in the chat, we just thought about asking, what do we think is going on with this loneliness rise? Is it the phones? Is it something adults are not doing? Is it something that's wrong with the school system? Is life just too fast these days? I'd be interested in hearing what you all think as to technically with our phone, which is trying to do the heavy lifting of Will's internet today, is keeping us super connected, but it's also not increasing loneliness. And one thing Mari said is it's about human to human, heart to heart connection, being in proximity with each other, where when we're busy and we're on our phones working from home, we're often not talking together. And then I know for me, I always think it's so sad to see a family, and not judging, but when you see a family out to dinner and everyone's just on their phone, it's like, what's the point of going out to dinner together? So I think it's interesting things to think about. But the part that I get sort of riled up about when we talk about loneliness is sort of what we're doing about it. And this graph is pretty self-explanatory that the what we're not saying this is a cause graph, right? We're not arguing that antidepressant prescriptions cause suicide. But what I can say is our approach to youth mental health is always intervention, and it's not a lot of prevention. Prevention isn't that attractive to funding bodies, to prevention doesn't really sell books because you can't measure prevention. It's super hard to measure what you prevented when most people don't do what you're trying to prevent. So take crime prevention. Most young people don't live a life of crime, so it's actually very hard to get longitudinal long-term data to prove it. But one of the things we noticed, not only from talking to these experts, but also in our role as clinicians and things we know from the research, many of the factors that are that do intervene, that improve social connectedness, that reduce loneliness, that reduce risk of suicide, are often kind of the same as prevention. It's increasing social connectedness that prevents this. But what we've tended to do in modern time is, like I joke about this all the time. In 1970s, we had about 60 different types of therapy. Today, we have over 1,000. And in our field alone, think about the name game that we play, like Nevin and I in outdoor work. We have outdoor therapy, adventure-based counseling, nature-based therapy. We're creating new and new things to somehow get better at improving social connectedness. That in some regard, this appears to be really deceptively simple, even though, as we said before, that simple can be elegant, but that doesn't mean it's not really hard as well. So the other sort of angle of this is, even with our big international bodies that are researching into what actually works, they're not really saying that what works is the right medication or the right empirically supported therapy or the right type of counseling or the right qualification, or you'll only be effective with so many years of experience. We know all of these sort of beliefs don't stand up in the evidence of what works. And when I found this study, again, from 2022, connectedness is a cornerstone of healthy development. Government programs focusing on reducing adolescent problem are mostly ineffective. So when we target the symptoms, when we target things without addressing the connectedness, we're going to miss the point. And as Kurt Hahn said, youth are crew, they're not passengers. And another way I like to think of it in my research is the clients that we work with aren't just the dependent variable of our work. They're not a neglected factor. They're everything to what comes out of the work that we do together. And then evidence suggests that successful programs aim to strengthen connectedness with parents, peers, schools, and community. So not just connectedness, therapist to client, teacher to student, but finding ways to bring in connectedness of the community, of the herd, like in the Lakota teaching story about the buffalo that Nevin shared. And then I just love this one because I think it's a really nice way to think about our clients and the people that we work with or the children that we raise. We view them as resources rather than problems. And so I think it's really telling that UNICEF, the research coming out of UNICEF is also speaking to what Martin is saying has been centuries and millennia of knowledge and understanding. Anything you want to add to that, Nevin?
No, maybe just on the loneliness front. We haven't added this yet, but there was a recent study around post-COVID remote workers. And this is just, I don't know, in the last few weeks, there was something that came out around the amount of people that were excited about getting to work from home. And that displacement from a place of work, or for organizations that actually closed structures and have remote working teams. Now there's evidence showing that we've got another sort of wave of loneliness coming from them because they're not even having the social connections between bouts of work. So there's just this ongoing desire for connection that is showing up in so many different places. And for you and I, Will, it's actually sometimes hard to pick which studies to use and which stories to use, because it's everywhere and it's happening, and it's hard to choose which ones to include.
Hmm. And another one, we have a researcher that I've been talking to at my school who has been writing about the loss of the third home, where you have your home, your work home, and then like the community pub or the every Saturday going to watch football together, that we're missing the third place where we can go for that social connectedness to increase that. Another one, I believe we talked about this last time, that during the pandemic as well, group sports plummeted, and now we're still seeing the rise of uh, individual youth sports, golf, tennis. So there's a lot of ways that this you can, as Nevin said, you can look at the story of social connectedness. Um, Now, and this was something Nevin said to me when we were putting this together, that it is whenever you're pulling out data and big graphs, it always feels daunting to be like, well, what the heck can I do about it? And and I often think it's in my brief experience teaching social work, I always think I meet students who really want what is the best way to work? What CBT, ACT, DBT, whatever T, where do I find the right one for me? Um, what's the right technique to use in the right situation with the right person? And I love this quote that it's less about getting the words just right. It's less about running the right activity, and it's more about really just the connection. The connection is the hard work. And in the therapy world, what we know is that your because we most of us will know that the therapeutic relationship, which is that includes not only being in a caring, warm relationship with someone, but it's also knowing why you're in a relationship, the purpose of your relationship. That is a great predictor of improved outcomes in mental health. Now, most people say no, duh. But the other side of that story is that the good working relationship will engage the client in the work that you're doing. So we all know this if we've ever sat in a classroom, you can be a great teacher to 80% of the students, and then you got to figure out what to do with the other 20% so they don't become like I was in school. And so that involves connecting, getting to know what works for that student. And so I think sometimes the easiest way we've crafted a narrative about mental health is this technique, this shiny new treatment, this theory of what's wrong with people. But really, the magic sauce is in the connection. And unfortunately, what makes that the hardest work is that is going to have to look different with every person that you work with. And that's, I think, the hardest part where I can only imagine being a high school teacher day in, day out, busy as hell, grading papers, teaching classes, planning lectures, while knowing there's two kids in your class that are really just switched out. I would think that would be so hard. Um, so I think that it's easy to point to the problem, but I think the hard work is knowing that we all can do the connecting, but that's the real harder work than finding a new technique or taking everybody camping like we do.
Can I add to that, Will? I think
Of
in talking to or talking about both Martin Brokenleg today and Mari Swingle's work, I think what we've taken from them, Mari from maybe a little bit of nostalgia and around her childhood, and I can relate to it because her and I are the same age, that there is a certain element of the way things were. And Martin's work speaks to the way things were for a long time. When we talk about cultural practices, traditions, teaching stories, he shared from Lakota teachings, but has also talked to people across cultures and around the world about traditions that are being preserved that actually assist in child rearing and keeping populations of children and youth and then adults healthy. And I think one of the things, Will, you and I have been talking about is that sometimes when you start talking about things that are traditional, it's somehow equated to being conservative, like you're trying to protect the old ways, as if that's a bad thing, when in fact it should be without judgment. Some things are the way they were for a long time because they worked. And when we start talking about having dinner together as a family, um, understanding the roles in a family and understanding how parents can role model behaviors and values for children. There's this false dichotomy in the world around left and right, and it shows up in politics and it shows up in our institutions where we're teaching, and it just seems to stifle conversation. And Will and I are at risk of, being attacked or challenged by suggesting things like looking back at traditions and saying maybe some of this works really well. Um, I think from Martin and his teachings that are informed by indigenous parenting styles, what I continue to hear in his language and his narratives and stories is that there's a significant amount of uncertainty that's reduced by following traditional practices and customs within the family and community. And so children growing up with adults seeing their roles and potential futures, there's less uncertainty. And certainty breeds security, and security in relationship, especially, will lead to greater mental health outcomes. And so there's certain parenting and cultural practices that stick across generations, and they don't tend to fall prey to new trends or innovations or technologies. And I think talking today about Martin's traditional ways, which can translate across cultures and practices, and Mari's work, which was really looking at technologies, starving and gorging, I think were great topics for titles for chapters that we've come up with from our experts. I mean, this is Will and I just sharing the knowledge of others, and I think it's been a wonderful experiment to interview these people across different sectors and domains, and to be able to put together their language in a concise way, and share it publicly. And that's why we're doing these talks too, is to get feedback on these comments and what we're sharing. And I think, to Jay's comment in the chat box about like Jonathan Haidt's work, what we found in looking at other people's work in this domain is that they've tended to focus in on very particular things. Like someone is focused on social media, and someone's focused on, early childhood development or outdoor risky play. And Will and I think, are both 40,000-foot view type folks, and we tend to get into the details when we need to do the work, but we're also expansive in our thinking and looking at this. And the reality is that the book is not going to cover everything that we want to cover because there's too many variables. But one that continues to rise to the top is being in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Being in relationships and showing up and being present for children and youth in their time of need, and not in their time of need, when they need to have someone there that's the older, wiser one.
Yeah. And I think also going back to the political angle of it, it is funny reading Jane Addams, that Spirit of Youth PDF I sent out, which must be one of the most progressive people of the time. And as in the word progress, making progress on what we have, as well. And I think that when I think of this work, and I try to think of it experientially, it's about the experience of being with youth, that I think is really a nice way to think about it, and that helps us to connect. And that doesn't mean we have to have things to do. It's doing something, like being together in the proximity with each other. And I think when I think about that experientially, I go, I wonder what this person is thinking about our experience together. Not, I wonder if this person thinks I'm the world's greatest therapist. Like, I want to know what they're taking away from this work. And so one of the things that all the experts talked about, and we'll definitely have to do a presentation about this at some point, is we interviewed all these experts, and Gordon Neufeld, I think, said it best when he basically said, well, the subtitle of your book should be "Don't Trust the Experts." And Nevin and I cracked up and went, well, that's kind of an odd selling point when we're kind of blaming all of you for the ideas that we have. Um, but I don't know if any of you know this story. There's a great TED Talk about it that you can watch. Um, and I've put a link to the study, and you can search Friendship Bench Zimbabwe. But basically, they gave grandmothers like a weekend training in relational problem solving because there was such a treatment gap in Zimbabwe. It was so long to see any clinician at all. And so they just grabbed the researchers knew grandmothers are just the most caring people in our community. And look at these numbers. Proportion of women with depression or suicidal ideation dropped 68 to 12%. It's incredible. The people who were scoring with very high clinical mental health symptoms, their scoring declined 52% to 4%. Now, I'm going to be a little Australia-centric here and not at all poo-pooing on one qualification or the other. If a profession speaks to you and you want to join it, go join it. But I remember hearing on the news in April last year, someone was on our local news saying this is why we need more psychologists to attack the suicide epidemic in Australia. And they showed the map of hotspots where most of these youth suicides were happening, almost all in rural communities. And the level of high school education you need to get into a clinical psychology program is so high, it mostly only comes from schools in urban areas. And I went, this is such a short-sighted way of thinking about solving this problem when what we need is more social connectedness. Again, we don't need more intervention. We need more prevention from the beginning, boots on the ground and caring people regardless of qualification. And you see, I put this term common factors there at the bottom because this is something that I get really passionate about because the most the most common thing we know about therapy, talking therapy in the research is that it works. The second most common thing we know about therapy in the research is all therapies tend to work the same. They rely on a therapeutic relationship. They rely on care and warmth, and they rely on the client believing that where they're at is the right place to be. And so believing that this is likely to help me. They need the brain to be switched on to that. And I don't think there's any qualification that teaches that in any way that all of us don't already know. And with that, Nevin, that's what we got. You were monitoring the chat. Thank you for that.
Do you want
How's our
put up,
time?
you want to put up your resources page at the end there,
Yeah.
Will?
And I'll send all that out. Some of these things have, I'll add a little bit more. You'll see the video at the bottom. I put Lisa D'Amour's a podcast there. She's doing an awesome job talking about teenagers and emotions. Um, and then some of the research as well. So I just put things that the full text is available, no paywall, and free stuff that might be useful, but I'll add some more as well.